It was a surprise visit. He arrived early by Chinook helicopter, which landed on the Chequers lawn. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, in his iconic khakis. Rishi Sunak in a more traditional suit. They look pleased to see each other and hugs in front of the waiting press.
Because we're real partners, Rishi knows all the details, what's going on our battlefield.
The UK Prime Minister promised more military aid to support Ukraine, including hundreds of air defence missiles and hundreds more long-range attack drones. And President Zelenskyy is still hoping for more in the form of fighter jets.
We want to create these, and I see that in the closest time you will hear some, I think, very important decisions, but we have to work a little bit more on it.
Since the war began, the UK has donated £4.6 billion in military aid to Ukraine, and experts believe it's been essential in helping them fight back against the Russian invasion.
The amount of military and economic aid coming from the United States, from other NATO countries, has been essential to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. But they are frustrated that the more advanced weapons that they have been asking for since the beginning of the big invasion always come after a long period of delay.
But with the war now heading into its second summer, how long can the West keep paying? I'm Leah Boleto, and this is the Sky News Daily. In a minute, we're going to hear more from former US Ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst, about why he believes continued military aid is the only way to end the war. But first, let's talk to our international affairs correspondent, Dominic Waghorn, who was at Chequers for the meeting.
Yeah, we're in a satellite truck parked up this country lane next to a field some distance from Chequers, but we can see it. But the atmosphere inside earlier was fairly businesslike, but I think, that Downing Street had laid on a show for him that was laden with symbolism. I think it was longer on symbolism than substance, though. And they chose to host him here. We overheard Rishi Sunak saying to President Zelenskyy that he thought it'd be better to get out here, to have the space to have a proper chat over both, I think, what Britain can do to help Ukraine now, but also the longer term help that Britain wants to give Ukraine.
So what was the symbolism for this meeting being held at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country retreat?
The reason it's symbolic is Chequers was the wartime retreat for Winston Churchill. And of course, Zelenskyy is a man who is compared to Churchill so often, seen as the Churchill of our times. And so he arrived his delegation, and he arrived in two Chinook helicopters landing on the lawns in front of Chequers. And then he was led into the mansion itself and taken to a room where Sunak said that Churchill had given some of his wartime broadcasts on the radio. And then back out into the gardens after they had a fairly lengthy tete-a-tete and bilateral meeting. Chequers has some rather fine formal gardens, and he was taken to the edge of those and looked out over the lawn again. And beyond those is an avenue of trees, the Victory Avenue it's called. These are beech trees that were planted by Winston Churchill at some point during the war or afterwards. So there was a lot of symbolism, and I think it was designed to sort of make the most of Zelenskyy's Churchillian credentials, and possibly in the absence of any more substantive help that Britain can offer Ukraine at the moment.
OK, so Dominic, what has Rishi Sunak actually promised Ukraine?
So what Britain's offering at the moment, in addition to the long-range precision-guided missiles that they provided, Storm Shadow, and which possibly were used for the first time over the weekend. There was an attack well behind enemy lines that I think many commentators may well have been a Storm Shadow missile. In addition to that, Britain is offering more anti-aircraft defence missiles and more drones as well. And also we heard from the Prime Minister saying that Britain wants to be part of a coalition of countries that will help send fighter jets to Ukraine, which would be music to Zelenskyy's ears, except for the fact there seems to be a longer-term ambition. It's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. So Britain and other Western nations are going to be working together to send the advanced Western fighter jets that the Ukrainians want, but not immediately, because they've got to train the fighter pilots. And although Britain's offered to train fighter pilots, that's not going to begin until the summer. So I think it's help that Zelenskyy wants to hear about. He's also been offered more Leopard tanks by the Germans on this 4-nation tour of Europe he's just been coming to the end of. But I think they would like to see more, have more sent their way. And I think there's some doubt about how effective their counteroffensive against the Russians can be until they get more of those kind of advanced weapons they're asking for.
And Dominic, you mentioned there, Zelensky is going on this charm offensive, in-person meeting with leaders in Germany, in France, in Italy, and obviously here in the UK with Sunak. What do you make of this tour? In particular, your thoughts on Zelensky's relationship with Sunak, because we know that his relationship with Boris Johnson appeared to be very close.
Yeah, there was a genuine kind of rapport and chemistry between Boris Johnson and President Zelensky it went beyond just the help Britain was giving Ukraine and that Johnson brought to the war, but it was a very personal chemistry clearly between the two leaders. I think Rishi Sunak, someone he doesn't know as well, and he's getting to know, but clearly they get on very well. There was a lot of laughter between them, a lot of bonhomie, and Zelensky he's a very charming man. He's very clever and capable of, I think, being all things to all men. So as we've seen with his oratory and different occasions, he tailors his words depending on the audience he's speaking to. And I think that happens also one-on-one as well. And clearly the two get on well. But I think there is a frustration amongst Ukrainians, not so much with Britain, but other European leaders are not being as forthcoming as they might have been. And even though they are now playing catch-up, it's coming a little bit too late. So, for instance, the Germans, who it took a huge amount of persuasion to agree to send Leopard modern battle tanks, have now kind of got to the point where they're saying to other countries, if you've got these tanks, they need to be sent. So kind of making up for it. They now have more than 200 battle tanks, which will give them considerable capability whenever this counteroffensive begins. But I think there is a sense that it's all coming a little bit too late.
So it's fair to say that there's been a lot of promises to Ukraine at this meeting, but maybe they shouldn't expect to receive much of it anytime soon.
I think along with other Western nations, the cupboard is beginning to become a little bare in terms of what the UK can spare at this stage. I think there's a worry across the West and in America as well that if they give the Ukrainians too much, they won't have enough left in terms of precision-guided missiles, in terms of advanced weaponry for other eventualities, maybe China attacking Taiwan or other possible threats down the line.
And Dominic, what do you think are the reservations from Western allies about arming Ukraine? Because they'll be trying to, I suppose, tread a line between supporting Ukraine and avoiding escalating tensions with Russia.
Yeah, I think there's a balance there, and the fears are that either Putin is forced into a corner where he uses more extreme methods. So either uses nuclear weapons, which he's kind of threatened to a number of times, a number of other Russian officials have as well, or there are a number of other things he could do. He could attack undersea cables. He could attack the kind of internet arteries of the world, or more gas pipelines under the sea, and all that could be very damaging economically. So I think there's a fear of what this could do to Putin if he's backed into a corner, and he's been very effective at exploiting that fear. So I think when you've got the hawks and the doves in Washington and other European capitals deciding at various stages during this war how much they give the Ukrainians, that's been the kind of tension, giving them enough to repel this invasion, but not enough to back Putin into a corner where he acts in a desperate way. I think there's another fear, though, as well, which is that if the Ukrainians are too successful and they resoundingly beat the Russians, say to the point where they lose Crimea, then that's a job-ending scenario for Putin. And Putin is so established at the top of what he's called himself the power verticals of his government. He's enmeshed himself in all the security agencies, all the branches of government, all the intelligence agencies, that if he was threatened, if he was removed from power because of the job-ending scenario of losing Crimea, if the leadership in Russia went to him and said, you've got to go, I think the fear possibly is of chaos in Russia, a kind of vacuum emerging that could see the Russian Federation disintegrating, and then this nuclear superpower becoming more of a sort of dysfunctional rogue state. And I think that is certainly a fear in the West as well.
And do you think that's something that Rishi Sunak and other world leaders are saying to Ukrainians, that they want to support them, but they have to tread this line?
But I think if you talk to Ukrainians, they say, well, those are valid fears, but we have to beat him resoundingly and decisively. so that he can't do this again. Their fear is that Putin is allowed to keep Crimea, or allowed to keep parts of the Donbass, and then therefore he has land from which he could do this all over again. And I think we're beginning to get to a point where the West and Ukraine is trying to find a way out of this. And I think the tensions between all those points is what's going to be kind of fought over and wrestled over between Ukraine and the West. And I think the sense we have at the moment is the Ukrainians are not going to be given enough to decisively beat the Russians, not to expel them from Crimea or Donbass. And I think the question is then what happens next? Does that give enough to the Russians to bide their time, wait a few more years and attack Ukraine again? Or can the Ukrainians be given enough to reassure them, say maybe a kind of de facto membership of NATO, if not a full-on formal membership of NATO? So I think those are the tensions between the West and Ukraine as they kind of deliberate over how they try and bring this terrible war to an end.
The UK is the second biggest donor of military aid to Ukraine. Only the US has spent more in the last few years, and they, along with other NATO powers, see it as vital for their own security that Putin doesn't win in Ukraine. And that's why they're happy to send billions. John Herbst is a former US ambassador to Ukraine and now runs the Eurasia Centre at the Atlantic Council think tank. So, John, hello to you. Just how important is it to the West that Ukraine wins this war with Russia?
The West has a vital interest in this war. Putin has an aggressive foreign policy designed to reestablish control over most of the space, if not all of the space, of the former Soviet Union. If he were to win his war in Ukraine, we have to worry about him committing aggression in other countries of the former Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan and Georgia, but also in other countries that were under Moscow's control, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which happen to be NATO members. The smart place to deal with Putin's aggressive foreign policy is Ukraine, a large country fighting brilliantly and bravely against overwhelming odds, but odds that we shorten by providing military assistance to Ukraine.
A lot was promised over the weekend to Ukraine. Why do you think now is it being asked for, and how significant is the aid that has been promised?
Well, the aid that the West has provided and has promised to provide to Ukraine has been essential for its victories on the battlefield. But Ukraine is asking for more advanced weapons that, actually, the United States principally, are too timid to send. Thank goodness the British decided to send Storm Shadow, just like, thank goodness, months ago, the British decided to send its Challenger tanks. Because up until the British decision on tanks, timidity in Berlin and in Washington was preventing the sending of Western tanks to Ukraine. The Brits embarrassed Washington and Germany, and thank goodness for that. Ukraine has been asking for long-range fires, missiles or rockets with a range of up to 300 kilometers. The United States here, too, has been too timid to send it. The Brits decided over the past week to send Storm Shadow with a range of 250 kilometers. And hopefully, too, this will knock Washington out of its complacency, so it, too, sends the longer-range fires Ukraine needs.
Well, Ukraine has been asking for military aid, specifically aircraft, since the beginning of this war. And so I wonder, as a former ambassador, you must be hearing from people inside the country. I mean, what are they saying about the support that they're being given?
Well, they are grateful because they understand that the amount of military and economic aid coming from the United States, from other NATO countries, from the EU, has been essential to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. But they are frustrated that the more advanced weapons that they have been asking for since the beginning of the big invasion always come after a long period of delay and after many refusals to send the weapons. That was true with the HIMARS artillery, with a range of 85 kilometers, which Washington only decided to send in June of last year. The Ukrainians were taking a massive punishment from the Russians in Donbass from early spring until we sent those HIMARS, and they immediately allowed Ukraine to go on the offensive. Now we see a similar timidity in Washington when it comes to sending the longer range fighters, the F-16s. And I don't have any doubt that if we were to provide those things, Ukraine could launch another major counteroffensive.
Do you think that continuing with military aid is the best way to end the war then?
Sadly, it's the only way. Despite his many defeats in Ukraine, Putin retains his original objective, which is to establish effective political control over the country. He's not going to settle for what he's taken thus far, and nor should Ukraine have to accept Russia gets to keep those territories that it has already seized. So Putin thinks that he can outlast the West. He understands that our aid has been essential to Ukraine's defense. He thinks we will grow tired of this, and that short-sighted people in the West will refuse to see that Putin's objectives go beyond Ukraine. So it would be strategically foolish for us to stop sending the weapons we send to Ukraine. The United States has provided about $55 billion of aid a year for the last couple of years to Ukraine. Looked at by itself, that seems like an enormous amount of money. But that money, both that economic and military aid, represents about 6% of our defense budget. With that 6% of our defense budget, Ukraine has destroyed approximately 50% of Moscow's conventional military capacity. That's a very strong investment in American and Western security.
But surely there's a limit to how much military aid can be provided to Ukraine. I mean, the UK and the US, they have their own defences to think about. You know, there's only so much the West can do.
Well, that's an interesting way to phrase it. And the only way it can be phrased that way if we fail to recognize the danger that Putin represents. You know, before the United States entered World War II, there were isolationist voices saying this was not an American fight. And they were saying, we can't afford to send those old destroyers to Britain because, you know, we were in a Great Depression. But in fact, had we not sent those old destroyers, had we not done Lend-Lease, the cost to the United States in defeating, in this case, Germany's aggression would have been far greater than it was. One of the problems with Western leadership in this fight, especially Washington's leadership, they refused to define to the American people the American stake in this war. Putin has said he wants to restore Moscow's control over all the space that used to make it the former Soviet Union. That means if Putin pursues these objectives, which he will if he wins in Ukraine, means that he may well be taking aggressive actions against our NATO allies, the Baltic states. So we might find ourselves in a fighting war with Russia. If you define it this way, the problem of Moscow's aggression is not just his war in Ukraine. It's the problem of containing a rogue nuclear power. And that is something which is very dangerous to our security, that rogue nuclear power, but also to our prosperity. In which case, providing, again, $55 billion a year from the United States to Ukraine for years to come is not a great expense.
Would you ever see a situation where there would be boots on the ground in Ukraine fighting Russian forces?
I don't think that's necessary. The Ukrainians have every reason to fight this fight because they're fighting for their lives as Ukrainians. They have proved to be able. Give them the means, give them the weapons, and not one Western boot needs to land in Ukraine to fight this war.
So, John, from your point of view, how likely is it that Ukraine can win this war?
I think that as long as Western support, anchored in the United States, remains at least what it is, Ukraine will win this war. But if we were to overcome our timidity and send the ATACMS, send the F-16s, Ukraine would deliver a crushing defeat on Kremlin forces. And this would eventually lead to a change in Kremlin objectives and a real peace, a just peace, a stable peace. Only a stable peace serves our interests. And that means Moscow ending its war of aggression in Ukraine, accepting Ukraine's right to choose its own political and economic system, as well as its own international relationships, and strong support from the West in terms of weapons, and hopefully a seat in NATO, membership in NATO, so Moscow understands it has to cease aggression.
My thanks to John Herbst and Dominic Waghorn, and to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Leah Boleto. This episode was produced by Rosie Gillett and Amy Lakin. Our editor is Philly Beaumont.